Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Better Business Podcast. We're your hosts. I'm Robbie Mazzini.
My name is Mike Gillespie.
And we're going to talk today about customer value. But before we do, we'll do a quick intro for ourselves. Mike, why don't you go first?
Yeah, again, my name is Mike Gillespie. I'm a local Boston resident here. I work in the home services business. I do real estate sales, property management, as well as home renovations. I also run a marine service business on the South Shore, servicing boats and yachts in our local area.
Awesome. So Robbie Mazzini, I'm the CEO of NetGreen Capital, and my background is in corporate finance. So I've done a few different gigs over my career, from business valuations to corporate FP&A, and now I'm more on the consulting and capital raising front, helping people with business planning and getting the funds they need to start their business or grow their business. And so today, we want to talk about customer long-term value. And if you've followed me at all on NetGreen Capital, you might have seen a couple of short clips I put up about this topic. So we wanted to do a longer conversation about it. And Mike, I'm going to ask you first, kind of, what do you think about when you think about customer value or customer success?
No, definitely a great question. I think it should be on top of everyone's minds. And when we talk about customer value, it's the benefit that the customer receives for a product or service, and kind of what that experience has been like through that whole buying or servicing process. So it's really coming down to the benefit the customer receives. Higher the benefit, the overall more value that you're providing. The lower the benefit, obviously not the best service, not the best product. It's that next one, I think.
Yeah, that's a great answer. One thing I'll add to that is like thinking about the customer relationship itself, right? Like it's like, we have a relationship, right? That's something you got to keep on going, like, right? You continue to service it, right? You and I aren't talking to each other. Are we really friends?
That's right.
Like, so that's something that I would add there, where like if you want to think about the long-term value that you as a business can provide for your customers, is how do you keep that relationship going in a way that they continue to be successful? So what are some things for you, Mike, that you think about if you're going to compare the differences of products and services, like a company that's manufacturing something versus a company that might be like what you're doing, like real estate, service related?
And it's always, I think, comes down to the actual cost and what the customer is receiving I think it's always on top of their mind, right? So if you're for instance, you're hiring a plumber to redo your bathroom, right? You're going to get a few quotes on what that cost is going to be involved with. But, and that's the same thing for a service. And I think the underlying value and the kind of underlying meaning that what we're looking for here, trying to identify, is kind of what type of value in that relationship that we're looking to create throughout that process to the customer's journey itself. Mm-hmm. Because we want to establish that relationship right at the beginning, go over all of our services or kind of identify the products that could help. And then from there, what does the customer journey look like?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, and I would say that one thing that's common between the two is that the relationship doesn't end when that product or service is delivered, right? So you buy an iPhone, you expect Apple to continue to provide customer support. Like if something breaks on the phone, you want to be able to call someone and get it fixed. That extends to like pretty much anything that someone buys. Something that companies don't do well is they don't think about, how satisfied your customer is for maybe even a future sale, right? Like people will have an expectation that, nothing lasts forever, but they also have an expectation of, I bought this thing for this much money. And in my mind, that came with a promise that it would last for 5 years or 10 years, but it broke after a year. And it was like 2 days out of warranty. And now I'm just like, well, okay, I'm not going to buy it from you again, So services are kind of similar in that regard, where you get a service from someone, say like consulting, like if I put together a financial model for someone, down the road, if something happens where a new project comes up or whatever, and they're having trouble with like a template that I made for them, for example, right? Like they would expect to be able to come back to me and like, hey, like, we had a little trouble figuring out how to plug this new project into that financial model that you did for us. Could you help us out? Like we could talk about my fee for any additional time separately, like whatever. but they expect to at least be able to like have that relationship with me and come back and like, we need your help again, right? Now, if I say like, hey, too bad, so sad, now that's a sunk cost for them because the financial model I built for them, it's not going to work. And they're going to have to toss it out. They lost all that value that I generated for them before, and now they have to go find a new consultant and start from scratch.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues in today's world too is, I think the businesses or the product suppliers need to kind of take a step back and put themselves in the shoes of the customer,
Yeah.
and try to really identify, okay, how are we going to create a high customer satisfaction right from the get-go?
Yeah.
Because as you mentioned, after this product and after the service that you might offer, what our goal is trying to create that greater loyalty with that specific customer. When it comes to greater loyalty to the product or service you're offering, the greater relationship, and then the repetitive business that you might have in the future once you identify that. So, and I think it's going to be like a process workflow, a process that service workflow, right? It starts from right as soon as we meet the customer. We're looking to provide as much value as we can at the beginning to make sure that they have a full understanding of what's happening. And it's up to us to manage those expectations throughout the process to create that highest customer value, highest customer satisfaction that we can achieve.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, all right, from there, let's move over to talking about, I wanted to talk a little bit about collaboration and competition on this front. This is something that's naturally a part of the business world. Lots of businesses collaborate, lots of businesses compete. I would argue that you need both to drive progress. So let me start with this. So one of the things I've been thinking a lot about recently is how I see life as more of a collaborative game. And I see a lot of people around treating life as a zero-sum game. And so for those who might not understand that term, zero-sum meaning that there's 100 apples, and that's all the apples there will ever be. And it's up to us to decide who's going to get those 100 apples, right? And lots of people treat life that way and think, well, if there's only ever going to be 100 apples, I should have all of them, right? And that is not the way to go about life, because sticking with the apple example, you can work on a farm and you can grow apples, right? That's a real world example, right? And if you work with someone else, you can grow more apples. And if you work with more people, you can grow more apples. And you get to a point where you put a handful of people together, you're growing so many apples that you start selling apples outside of your own farm and your own community. And then that's how you start generating value for other people. So that's just to say that life is a collaborative game, not a zero-sum game, right?
Yeah.
So,
and to put more emphasis on that too, it's like that expression, you could go far by yourself, but you go even further with a team.
mm-hmm.
So in the right establishment here is, you mentioned apples, but I look at it as a big piece of pie.
Yeah.
And then as of, depending on what industry that you're in terms of competition, we're trying to get as many slices of that pie as we can. Right. So if you're working by yourself and you're great at what you do, you might be able to achieve only a little smidgen of it. But guess what? I'm hungry. So I want as much pie as I can.
Yeah.
So it's having the right pieces in place, trying to create that customer value, trying to drive systems that kind of can achieve as much as that pie as I can get.
Yeah, that's right. So at the end of the day, if you collaborate and you work together, you really can achieve more for everyone involved, all the participants, and you get to a point where that excess can then provide more for other people versus if we all act like everything's finite, then we all start stepping on each other's toes and things get a little cutthroat.
That's right.
So where in your life, if you got anything off the top of your head, have you ever seen zero-sum reasoning? Get any examples off the top of your head?
I think we should dive into what zero-sum means for the audience. If you want to kind of go into detail and say,
if you want to elaborate,
if you wanted to kind of, what is your picture of zero-sum?
Yeah. Okay. So I see it a lot. Let's think about the stock market, for example. Now, technically, there's no upside or there's no limit to the upside in the stock market, right? but that's not how people behave in the stock market, right? People behave as if they do need to take it all. You see this behavior from hedge funds, for example. There's a great book. I can't remember the author, but I remember the book is called Flash Boys. And that book is all about all the billions of dollars that hedge funds dumped into buying up data servers on top of the New York Stock Exchange and the Chicago Options House. So they wanted data servers as close to the exchange as possible. And then they started dumping billions of more dollars into the fiber wire that went from the New York Stock Exchange to the Options House. Now, the reason that they were doing this is because they realized that if they could get their processing speed to beat the average investor, even by like you're talking, I think it was nanoseconds. I mean, the milliseconds or nanoseconds. Like that's the short duration of time you're talking about. They were able to make like fractions of pennies on every trade by beating investors just simply on that like information advantage, right? That's a real world example of them acting as though it's a zero sum game, even though it's not, right? So they're trying to squeeze that orange for every drop that it's worth as if it's the only orange in the world.
Yeah. So no, I think you're absolutely right. And then depending on whatever business model that you're running, whether it's service or product based industry, we're always thinking about, okay, what other additional aspects I can run my particular business to gain revenue share, right? So you mentioned the stock options, the markets, and kind of the Fed doing what they did to kind of get that additional revenue. And I think that zero sum kind of means, okay, what other practices can you be doing outside of the scope of your business to kind of drive that revenue that you're missing out on?
Yeah. So let's now talking about competition in more of a positive light, because I think there is a positive side to it. And I would say the difference is thinking about competition as like a friendly rivalry versus thinking of it rather in more of like a warlike sense, in that like going back to that zero sum example of like, well, there's not enough for all of us, so I'd rather it's me, not you. Okay. But that's not how competition has to be. Competition can be a friendly rivalry, right? Like that's what kids do on a playground, right? You all get stronger by playing rough with each other, right? But like there's no hard feelings at the end of the day, you know? So that to me is how I think of like competition making companies better, is like competitive pricing, for example, right? Now, competitive pricing is an example of where competition is better for the customer, right? This is what free markets revolve around, you know? So like if there's only one company, we call that a monopoly. If there's a monopoly, they can charge whatever price they want. This is where utility companies are an interesting example here, because utilities are technically a monopoly, but they're a government-sponsored monopoly, right? For my house, for example, we only have Comcast available. I have no kind words to say about Comcast. I would take another service provider in a heartbeat, but I don't have another service provider available here. So maybe Starlink. I might go with Starlink. Yeah. Yeah. And Starlink is competitively priced so that it would be a little cheaper for me per month, right? So it really just comes down to like, okay, is their service comparable? If their service is comparable, I may as well save a few bucks a month and go with Starlink, right? Mm-hmm. So like, I don't know if there's anything you want to add on that front when you think about like the positive light of competition and how it makes business better, at least especially from like a customer perspective.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head here. Mentioning Xfinity, and that's kind of the only service provider in the area, right? And for other communications businesses, what do they have to do, right? They have to kind of get out in this area and kind of identify themselves as being the next best service provider. Meaning Starlink is another service coming back. Unfortunately for you, it's only Xfinity. But as those other communications companies come in and create more of a branding perspective, now I don't know Xfinity, but I know Rob's Communications LLC. You know, these guys look pretty cool. Let me do some more research and see how they are. So I think it comes a little bit more of the branding perspective and kind of identifying a target local market that they could actually acquire more of that pie in that specific area.
Yeah, that's right. Then so I'll mention quick on the collaboration front. I think it's like I think it's more obvious how collaboration is beneficial to customers. But a couple of examples I would give is imagine so you're a software company. You can provide a better software service to your customer if you're only trying to optimize for solving one problem. So what I see so a lot of large companies will they prefer to have like an ERP, for example, and that's an enterprise software solution that just does it all. An enterprise solution that does their customer service, does their accounting and finance, and does maybe their like inventory management or whatever else they have going on, right? The problem with that is often those systems are very expensive because of all the development work that goes into like putting all those pieces together, and they're not very good for what you get. You don't really get the value. The customer value is low there because they're not really doing any of those jobs particularly well. And again, you're paying like a high price tag for it. Large companies don't really care because it's the peace of mind of just like, yep, I got one provider and then that's like done. And then they don't care because they don't care about their budget, right? So for a lot, like what I see a lot of smaller companies do that particularly care about being nimble, and I have this experience myself because I have a small budget for NetGreen. I like to keep my company lean and think about like scaling profitability, right? So if you're a small company, you want that lean budget. You'd rather have like a best-in-class provider that gives you like at least maximizes the value that you're going to get for the price you pay, right? And so when you come at it from that angle, you don't care about having the big name behind your software solution that does all of your software solutions. You want the big name that does each job well. So you just pick the best email provider. You pick like the best like archiving solution. You pick like the best like video editing software, et cetera. You're really just worried about like, I want to, and typically you'll notice that those prices are lower. So at the end of the day, you end up spending less money and getting more for what you do spend. You could argue that it's like, well, you got to keep track of that stuff. It's like, yeah, you got to keep track of that stuff, but like you're saving money, and I would argue that it's worth it. And then, so where I would tie that into collaboration is those software companies can collaborate, and how they do this is they make it so that their APIs plug into each other. That's what you're seeing software companies do a lot these days is they think about like, how does my software play with other softwares, and how do we collaborate with that company particularly so that our APIs work well together and can plug in.
Yeah, definitely. And I think understanding that whole workflow, where they are, where the customer is at the beginning of the stage to where they are, where they see themselves at the end of the stage, kind of identifying where they are and communicating back to them where that transformation is actually happening. I think is very important.
Yeah, that's right. And since we are picking on some large companies, let's pick on them a little bit more. Swinging back to the competition front and how that does, in fact, competitive pricing and other things like that. And I would say even beyond the pricing, it's also competition driving development. Like this is where disruptive companies enter the scene, right? So disruptive companies come into an industry because they have a new idea, right? This is where you have a revolutionary change. There's a difference between so thinking about like products, right? I think about this is something we can actually go back. We'll do a little quick history lesson. The Roman Empire, they were very technologically innovative early on, but that technological innovation stagnated. And what they were really doing better and better over time was really just material science. So they were having less revolutionary changes, and they were stagnating because they were just they were figuring out how do we just do what we're already doing more efficiently. And that works for a while, and it should be done. But, you can kind of relate this to where we are in America now. If you go back and you look there's a show that's a predecessor of the Yellowstone series, and I forget the name of the show, but it's based in the 1920s.
Yeah.
And you look at the houses there, and you compare that to a house today. There's nothing new in your house today other than your cell phone, right? It's all the appliances were there 100 years ago. All the comforts of home were there 100 years ago. All we're doing is making them more efficiently. We're making them cheaper. And that's fine. That's a good thing. but like, where's the revolutionary change? And now we're kind of seeing some of it. Like, we're seeing like AI kind of take over, and we're going to do a future episode on this. And there's some promise that like fusion energy might actually be within grasp now. We'll see how that shakes out. But we haven't had a ton of like technological revolutions other than the computer. And then even now, like the cell phone is just a better version of a computer that was already invented, like, not quite 100 years ago, but almost,
Yeah.
And so thinking about that and like the need for disruptive companies to enter markets to like really drive like that revolutionary progress that gives you the leap to the next step. What large companies do is they don't like that, right? Because large companies, they get slow, they get systematic. There's good and bad to that, right? Like, but I would say the bad to it is that they're not adapting to change. And if you're not willing to adapt to change, that means you're not going to be optimizing for customer value, because customers need you to be able to change and adapt to the world as it changes also. And if you can't do that, then you're not delivering the best service you can to your customer, right? And where large companies actually go out of their way to erode customer value is the introduction of regulation, right? So large companies with those big budgets pay for lobbyists. They send those lobbyists to Washington and they get regulation put in place. Regulation is not necessarily always a good thing. And in fact, it becomes excessive very quickly. And most regulation in America is not a good thing because it is strictly designed to reduce competition. And we're supposed to have a free market. And what you see is regulation barring those disruptive companies are having an easier time of entering the marketplace to begin with. So they really need to get a lot of financial backing behind them, which is difficult to do. It's part of the reason why I wanted to start Net Green Capital. But that's difficult for them to get into the market in the first place and start driving that progress. And this regulation, these regulatory fees, right? This becomes a hidden tax on all of us, all people, but particularly the would-be customers of those companies, right? Because it increases prices and it makes it take longer to provide a service or a product because of all the regulatory hurdles that have to be jumped through. So that ultimately like erodes customer value. And I know you recently dealt with some regulatory change yourself in the real estate industry. If you want to maybe relate that to this a little bit.
Yeah, no, I can definitely do it. We had a change in August that went from the buyer paying, we'll say, during the overall buying and purchase of real estate, we identified there was an issue and it didn't give clarity to the seller about how our buyer agents getting paid. Previously, it would actually come off the sales price. Now, for more clarification, they kind of did. There was no transparency to the seller. So instead of having the seller pay the buyer's commission, when a typical buyer, a new buyer, comes into the market, they actually have to sign an agreement with the buyer's agent, identifying what that fee is going to be paid to the buyer's agent directly. So instead of going in from the seller, now the buyer agent gets it. So it's actually just kind of a linear problem, right? It's like we're still getting paid, but where is that fee coming from? So, and it was a little confusion at in the start of August, identifying that just because no one knew where that money was actually coming from. So it was actually kind of that process where you actually had to be more educational and be more informative. Identifying kind of where that process happened and where the outcome is actually going to happen. But once you have that conversation, and I think this is going back to what you mentioned, customer value, identifying every single step within your process, whether it's selling a product or a service, just to make sure the customer understands every step of the way and kind of pictures their journey and where that outcome's going to be.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Like these, and on that note, like, these hurdles can obviously be overcome. You have to be able to like communicate. For myself, like, there's regulation around ACH payments, for example, right? So one of the reasons that we have a limit on the ACH payment on NetGreen currently is because of some ACH fraud that was taking place with our bank provider, North Capital. So they want us to be putting a deposit down for the ACH. Now, the reason they needed us to put a deposit down for the ACH is because their prior method of dealing with this was if you requested I want to cancel my investment, okay, which is totally fine. We're going to send you your money back. Not a problem, right? The issue that was happening with the fraud is they would then go to their bank and issue an ACH refund through the bank. So this fraud would get a refund from the platform, right, through the bank that we're using, right, North Capital in this case. So North Capital pulls the money back out of the escrow, sends it back to the investor. Now the investor, who in this case is committing fraud, talks to their bank and gets a double refund through the ACH payment being withdrawn also. So now North Capital goes from we gave the $10,000 back to owing $10,000 to the bank. And this all happens within a certain amount of time so that there's no way to track it before all the money is back in the investor's hands and now that money's gone.
Yeah.
Okay, so what they were doing to stop this is they were holding all ACH refunds for 60 days because 60 days is the clearing period for the bank. After the 60-day period, the bank won't do that anymore. So you can't go to your bank and try and get that double refund. The SEC cracked down on them for that. They said you can't. I shouldn't blame the SEC. They're a FINRA member like everyone else, and I believe it was FINRA in this case that cracked down on them. But in either case, between the SEC and FINRA, they got cracked down on that. Like, hey, you can't do the 60-day hold. So now that puts it on me. Like, I have to now put a deposit down for the ACH amount in order for us to continue using ACH payments, right? Mm-hmm. So now I have to limit how much my customers, in this case investors, can pay through ACH. So if they want to go over that ACH limit, they have to now use check or bank wire, right? Mm-hmm. So that's just an example of like how regulation trickles down, and then I have no choice but to pass on some sort of restriction or inconvenience to my customers because it got passed on down to me, right? And that's how regulation can affect customers. In addition to the fact that we're a business, we have to make money. Because I have to deal with regulation on the back end, I have to charge a certain amount to either my issuer, the businesses trying to raise the money, or the investor, like coming on to invest, because I have to collect money somehow, some way to make to be able to be a profitable business and stay in business, right? That amount of money that I charge to them is now higher because of all the regulatory fees that I have to pay and all the time commitment that I have to satisfy all the regulatory requirements, right? And that's true in any industry that's regulated. The finance industry is heavily regulated. I'd say the finance industry is interesting because a lot of it is probably justified. But there's also plenty that's not. There's lots of things in the finance industry that aren't regulated at all that cause massive problems. Like go back to the 2007-2008 financial crisis where they were issuing CDMOs and other insurance derivatives that completely crashed the market because people knew it was going to crash and they were essentially shorting the market. And there's no regulation around that, and no regulation was put in place after that really changed the way business was being done. And rather than slapping the wrist of these banks, they just gave them big bailouts. People look at that and we all know that it's wrong, right? But we have to realize that that goes on in other industries too. That's not just a finance industry thing. That goes on in other industries too. You see it a lot with insurance. You see it a lot in healthcare and pharmaceutical industries. And the more massive these companies become, the more likely they are to be able to get away with it. And that's a problem. That's a problem for us as Americans because again, those regulatory fees, those become hidden taxes that we pay.
Yeah. And then, in your opinion, just because I'm on kind of the fence with the regulation and lobbyists, and I think change is good.
Yeah.
Right. And from your perspective, do you think it's detrimental for regulation, and how does that affect the customer? Do you think it's better for businesses, or is it worse for small businesses? And then how does that kind of interpret in terms of change? Without regulation, do we have changes in our business sector? And then who, I guess, is the underlying entity that gets most affected with regulation?
Yeah. So I think overall regulation is very detrimental to economic growth. mainly because, particularly in America, where you're trying to have a free market structure, you want to really do everything you can to support small business, and small business gets hurt the most by regulation because they, again, have those smaller budgets, and when those smaller budgets get eaten up by those regulatory fees, which are usually fixed, right? So, like, a small company has a $1,000 budget, a big company has a $10,000 budget. The regulatory fees are $500. So you just took 50% of the small business budget, but you're only taking a fraction of the large budget, right?
Yeah.
So that's just something to be considered when we have these conversations about regulation that people need to remember is they do, in fact, hurt smaller companies more. The other thing, too, that I would say is we kind of have this problem in America currently that we've not had in the past, but is becoming more prominent, where we expect the government to intervene on everything, particularly the federal government. And we have to remember that our society and our government were initially set up so that the freedom was given to the people, and we tell the government for us. Okay. And one of the things that the founders put in place was everything should be localized as possible. So things that can be settled on the town level should be settled on the town level. Things that need to be things that are like from one city to the next, like intercity trade or whatever, then you handle it on the state level. And then similarly, like interstate affairs, you handle at the federal level. So you only escalate from town to state to federal as things like grow and actually need that level of management. You don't try and manage things for your town by going to talk to the president and Congress about like trying to pass some bill for you. You go to a town meeting for that, right?
Yeah.
That's how government should work, where it should be as local as possible for the problem being solved. And I would say that we've gotten into this bad habit of like thinking that the federal government should be solving all of our problems, and we're not willing enough to do it ourselves. Like a lot of problems don't need to be solved by the government at all. Like there's some things that can just be solved by societal norms, cultural values. And this is particularly true with small business. So if you're a small business, you're a mom and pop's shop, like maybe you're a small restaurant on Main Street, you have to face your customers every day. So if you're doing something to piss off your customers, right? Like maybe you're dumping your trash in the river instead of in a dumpster, or maybe you just like got cockroaches running around your kitchen. Like like it's fine. Like we should have a health inspector going in to deal with like the cockroach issue. It's fine to have the guidance that like, hey, your dumpster goes in the dumpster, etc. But at the end of the day, you're doing this in the sight of your customers are going to call you out on it because your community is going to call you out on it.
Yeah.
Your community is going to say, hey, we're not going to go to this place anymore. It's disgusting. You're going to go out of business. Like they've got that vote because you have to serve them every day and your business is going to fail.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how these problems really get solved, right? Like I don't need a regulator to tell me like I'm not going to go to a place that has cockroaches running around because, well, that place is disgusting. So again, it's not that I'm just using an extreme example. It's not that there shouldn't be regulation about cockroaches. I'm just saying like these are the types of things where if you're not serving your customers as a small business, you go out of business, period. As a big business often gets detached because the people at the top making decisions, they don't face the customers every day. So they don't face the repercussions of not satisfying those customers. And further, say it's a manufacturing company. How many CEOs at a company, say you have like 10,000 employees, right? And you have like factories spread across the US. How many CEOs of a large manufacturing company go around from factory to factory to factory, walking the floor, meeting people, learning what their problems are, seeing where the bottlenecks are? Like, I can say that like I would try to make that attempt myself. Mm-hmm. Very few people do. You see it from people like Elon Musk. Elon Musk knows what's happening at his businesses, right? There's very few people like that. There's very few people that take the time to care at the top. And you see that level of detachment. That's what eventually erodes customer value. Mm-hmm. And then when a disruptive company does break through that regulation, like that little wall of regulation that they put up around themselves, a disruptive company comes through and they get taken out. Yeah. You see it with like one of the most recent examples would be like Netflix taking out Blockbuster, right? Blockbuster could have adapted. Blockbuster could have easily adapted their model. They just didn't take the threat seriously.
Yeah. And I think talking about regulation and then kind of keeping customer value at top priority, it's so easy to kind of pass down fees, right? Yeah. And it's from the regulation changes. It's so easy to me to go to, we'll say, my sub businesses.
Yeah.
That's going to be upcharged. The other businesses, they're going to upcharge, and it also funnels down to the customer.
Yeah.
It was what I've been seeing more and more of, and it's like driving me crazy. Is I was down the Cape over the weekend, and I went to my local pizza store, and just because of that transaction fees being paid on credit and debit cards, they keep going up and up and up. So you have these small mom and pop stores trying to adapt and trying to obviously keep their customers happy, but now they're getting hit with that 3.5-4% premium on any card usage.
Yeah.
So what do they have to do? They have to put a sign in saying, "Hey, you get a 4% discount if you pay cash."
Yeah.
Nowadays, 1 out of 10 people, I'm the only one that carries cash around.
Yeah.
So it's basically trying to do the best for the customer, but also keeping a strong business up and running and managing those costs and expectations.
Right.
So I hope that within 2025, we see more regulation that's not so much from the overall business perspective, but with a customer focus in mind.
Yes.
Just because they've been kind of, it's not cheap, regardless of any cost of service that you're providing out there. Everyone's been kind of seeing that premium across the board. And then what can regulation do is kind of help that, put that in the customer's favor so they get a better experience at less cost.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah. So just go to that pizza example. One thing that came to mind was just like thinking about it from their perspective. At a pizza place, you already have pretty tight margins on how much you're going to make, right? So you're kind of like don't really have a choice about charging that 3 or 4% to the customer. So now from the customer perspective, what's your sales tax? Well, it's 6% if you pay with cash, but it's 10% if you pay with your card. Right. So that's just something to keep in mind there. And I wholeheartedly agree with you where I would like to see a lot of regulation slashed, but at the same time, new regulation being implemented that's customer focused and protects the customer from these hidden fees and whatever else being passed on down to them. Put limits on things and do it in a way that doesn't make it harder for the business to survive and thrive, but just do it in a way that like actually protects the customer and gives the customer more bargaining power.
Yeah. Why make regulation more harder for me where it's then in return going to be more harder for the customer?
That's right.
Right. So, and hard to mean money. So it's going to be more expensive.
Yeah. All right. So we're wrapping up here, and I want to do a lightning round at the end of our episodes. So today I got some questions for you, and I'm going to rattle these off, and you just give me a one-word answer. Most of these are just yes or no, but one of these you'll just give me a one-word answer on, and don't think about it. Just do your instinct.
And then, I don't think.
Yeah. And then in the future, you come with your questions, and you can hit me with these too. All right. So here we go. Has a customer ever swore at you?
Yes.
Is the customer always right?
Yes.
Do you prefer to compete or collaborate?
Compete.
Have you ever wanted to slap a customer?
No.
Are we going to have a peaceful inauguration?
I hope so.
Me too, brother. All right. Hey, that's a wrap.
That's right. This is Mike and Rob from Better Business. Thank you for tuning in.